Okay, good morning. Let's open in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you for your prophetic word that you have seen fit to give us some guidelines and insight as to the things that we can expect to come on the world in the times in which we live, and the things to watch out for, the things to be on guard for. We pray that we will take these words to heart. Pray you'll bless us this day in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we talk about each week the convergence of events. And I'm really only going to focus on a couple of things this week because they're the most important. So really, you could probably divide this into three topics. And in light of the deal of the century that was announced this week in a meeting at the White House between President and a conference with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. On Tuesday, I thought it would be appropriate that we title this week's update of the Century. Now, I know somebody's going to criticize me for being arrogant and that type of thing, and if I was arrogant, it would be Update of the Millennium. Okay, but it's not Update of the Millennium. So it's a little bit, please understand that the titles sometimes are a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and it is a very, I've used this cover from Foreign Policy for years now, and when it seems like the world is not disrupted, I will take it out of my slide deck, but until things calm down, which I frankly don't expect them to do, I'm going to leave it in. So the first thing I'm going to talk this week about is just briefly about this coronavirus. Now, we know about the verse in Revelation, talking about the fourth seal and pale horse and pestilence and beast of the earth, wild beast. I don't really have time to go into it this week, but if you look at the Greek word there about a beast, it really means, a lot of people interpret that to mean, animals will be, wild animals will be attacking people, but the word there might actually refer to microbes, microscopic things, germs and that type of thing, bacteria. And I think that might actually be a more accurate understanding of what that says. And so we should expect things like that. This is a picture of, I can't remember if this is Wuhan or Shanghai, but what you're seeing all across China with this coronavirus is the streets are largely empty. Streets have been shut down. The World Health Organization has announced that it is a healthcare crisis. Interestingly enough, though, they did not say much of anything about restricting travel, but a lot of governments, the United States government and other countries, have stepped in and said, no travel to China. And this is causing a lot of problems. Here's a headline this morning from the New York Times. China kept the world in dark as the outbreak rippled. Now, I don't know, I'm really not a prophet. I talk about prophecy, but that doesn't make me a prophet. I don't know what this thing is going to be like. I don't think anybody really knows what it's going to be like. There's a lot of indicators that it could be a pandemic, but it may not be a super deadly pandemic. On the other hand, there are some things that indicate that they've done some genetic testing, DNA analysis, RNA analysis on the strains of virus, and they found that there's a sequence in the virus that some reports are, and I'm only going to say what the reports are, that it was spliced in from HIV virus. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. There is some indication that some of the drugs being used to treat patients are HIV type drugs. So I don't know that the death rate is that high, but it really is growing. And you see interesting thing. Here is this is a subway in Beijing. I mean, this is one of the largest cities on the planet. Below is the central high-speed rail station in Beijing. This usually is teeming with people. And I think you would have to search long and hard to find only one person, a couple people sitting there in waiting areas at that rail station. Again, the New York Times has some articles about some of the things that are being done, And the thing that's interesting is, I mean, Wuhan is a city of somewhere 9 to 11 million people. It's bigger than New York City. And I would be fair in guessing, I think, or I think it would be a fair guess, that very few of us had ever heard of Wuhan before this outbreak started a couple weeks, at least hit the press a couple weeks ago. Now, China's, been criticized. They didn't do enough. They're overreacting. They're not reacting quickly enough. Everybody's got an opinion about what they should or shouldn't do and how bad this is going to be or how bad it's not going to be. But one of the interesting things is I played last week, I think it was last week, they were putting together this hospital. And so we're going to build a hospital in 9 or 10 days. And so here you see all these things. They're actually building 2 of them. One of them is a 1,000-bed hospital. That's a huge hospital. So I thought I would give you an update. So here we are 9 days after construction started. This is what it looked like. And essentially what they did was they turned the keys over to the authorities and said, okay, your hospital's ready to go. So I think HGTV is checking in with them about doing Extreme Hospital Makeover or whatever that show was where they used to build the house in 3 days or a week. So it is a interesting response that they had to that. Well, so a week ago, we talked about a little bit the Trump peace plan was coming. And there was a lot of speculation by people what it was going to contain, what it was not going to contain. And I did come to one conclusion this week as I actually did an interview on Wednesday about the peace plan. I actually got one thing wrong, and I apologize for that. It was 181 pages, and I just had only quickly read one of the pages about the right of return for the refugees, Palestinian refugees, and I'll talk a little bit about that if I remember. But the one thing I saw is everybody has an opinion about the peace plan. So my conclusion is this: the only thing spreading more rapidly in the world right now than the coronavirus are opinions about the Trump peace plan. And everybody has one. So when Netanyahu left Israel last Sunday, he said, I'm going to the U.S. and we're going to make history. Danny Gantz, who is running against him for the Blue and White Party in the elections coming up 4 weeks from today. I guess it's four weeks and a day, because I forgot this is leap year. So on March 2nd, they'll go and vote. Gantz actually came to the United States and had a meeting with Donald Trump. So they went to the White House on Tuesday. You can look up the video and watch the video of Trump and Netanyahu as they announce the peace plan. I don't think it's going to be accepted. Even Naftali Bennett said that if the settlements are included, he would support the peace plan. He is the leader of the New Right Party in Israel. And they came out, Trump's going to reveal the map, finally the map. And even in the Arab press, this is from Lebanon, the newspapers were essentially saying, Saudi-funded deal of the century. And this from the Arab News, an editorial, peace deal. The egg is being hatched, but it's already in the grave. You see the symbolism there. Now, one of the interesting things is there's been, over the last 3 years, ever since Jared Kushner and Trump announced that they were going to come up with this deal, this plan, and I don't think Trump ever really referred to it as the deal of the century. That came from a newspaper article, but everybody calls it the deal of the century. But one of the interesting things is that there were leaks all the way through. And I've talked about the leaks. And every time the leaks came out, people would say, oh, this is terrible, he's not going to, or Trump would never do that. And what I'm looking at is I look through the leaks. This is a summary of leaks that Daniel Pipes came up with, is that the leaks regarding the plan were highly accurate as to what they said was going to happen. So, for example, in the leak at the top, in the top left-hand corner, February of 2018, leaks from a knowledgeable Arab diplomatic sources quoted in Asharq al-Awad, that's a London newspaper, also reported in the Times of Israel, and they said that there would be certain things. U.S. recognition of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. And when these reports came out, a lot of people would say, oh, Trump would never do that. Trump would never do that. And as I look through and you can go to danielpipes.org website, and you can download a copy of all of his, like 4 pages of these leaks that he's tracked. And the interesting thing that I found is that the leaks turn out to be, in hindsight, pretty accurate. Because the plan does provide a recognition of a Palestinian state. It said place the old city of Jerusalem under international protection. That's not actual. That one's not too accurate. Palestinians give up their demand for a right of return. That's actually in the plan. So if you go down to the second one, March 2nd, 2018, the Palestinian Authority negotiator Saeb Erekat released his view of the Trump plan: recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the U.S. embassy to the city. This was before that happened, which happened in, I think, May of 2018. The Trump administration would invent a capital for a Palestinian state in the suburbs of Jerusalem. This is exactly what happened. So in some respects, the plan is very new, and in some respects, the plan just builds on older plans that have been in place for a long time. I'll go through some of the details of the plan because I think they are important. I'll discuss a little bit of, is it prophetically significant or not? Does it change things? And then we'll look at the reaction to that. And then at the end, I have a little thing that I want to talk about Israel's security, particularly in Syria. And I have a couple 5 or 6 minute video clips that I think are highly instructive on that particular issue. So hopefully we'll have enough time to cover all of those. So here, the plan was, it had 2 maps in it. The left-hand map was for the state of Israel, and the right-hand map is for a future state of Palestine. So if you hear an objection that this does not divide the land, okay, it doesn't because it hasn't been accepted yet. But if accepted, it would divide the land. And the proposal from the Trump administration is to divide the land of Israel into a state of Israel and a Palestinian state. This cannot be argued any other way. And this is what's happening. Now, there are land swaps. Israel gets some land, but the Palestinians get a lot of extra land in this. Let's look at them a little bit more. Here's the map for the future state of Israel. I'm trying to remember what the next one is. And another thing that is said, that I've heard said is, nobody's ever done one of these with a map before. They've always had maps. Okay? So this is the future state of Israel. And you can see there's little numbered cities. These are enclaves, settlements. It only numbers about 15, I think 15 of them. And the map is not entirely accurate, although I suspect that there is a very detailed map down to, specific residences that exist, and it's going to be released at some point. So the dark green area will be a future Palestinian state. It will have roads that will connect it. Now, when you go to Israel today, if you go up into Samaria or Judea, but particularly up into the Samaria region, which Judea and Samaria would be south of Jerusalem, Samaria would be north. So the dark green area there at the northern part, here I've got a little, I thought I had mine. Hang on here. So So the northern part, this would be Samaria, and right in here would be Ramallah. It's just a little bit north of Jerusalem. That's the capital right now of at least where the administrative offices of the Palestinian Authority is. And there's a lot of very fancy buildings and homes and everything that have been built there by the suffering Palestinians. It's when you drive up through that area, it's kind of shocking. But going up through that area is a highway called Highway 60, and it goes all the way down to Beersheba in the south. It goes through Hebron, comes up through Jerusalem, it goes up north past Ramallah, all the way up to near Nablus. So it's a highway, but it's when you drive it, it's like its own contained unit. There are little turnoffs here and there, but it's not easy to get in and on or off of it. Sometimes you have to, you can, but it's difficult unless you know your way around. So there are overpasses, underpasses, and everything. It's to be separate from the Palestinian area. And it's done for security. So it goes up through there, and then there are places where you can get onto it. But when we were there, because of security reasons, it was during the Trump visit, and everybody, because Trump had been talking about working out this peace deal early in his administration. This was in May of 2017. They would have these checkpoints where they just come in and they just shut down the roads. And you'll come up and there'll be 5 or 6 IDF soldiers there blocking your access to it. So fortunately, we were someone who knew all the back roads, and we were able to get on and off 60 pretty much whenever we wanted, although we had to do a runaround. And when you're up there, like if you're on the Israeli road and you put in Google Maps, I want to go to this place, like you want to go to where the Tel is for this biblical city of Ai, you will get this message: route not possible. Because Google, the computer will not, it just won't compute a route for you. And sometimes if you do a route to a place from Jerusalem to the north and you want to go up through the center, Google Maps will route you all around, and that routes you down in the valley, this way, up along the coast. And I mean, it's just, so what really is only a 45-minute drive, when you get your Google Maps result, it'll be a 4-hour and 45-minute drive because of the way they route you around all of the security issues. But what they're going to do is they're going to take what they've done with the Israeli highways, the highways for Israeli citizens. They're going to do sort of the same thing to connect these areas for the Palestinians, including a proposed tunnel of some kind between Gaza and it will come in near Hebron, or Hebron as they call it. That's about 35 to 40 kilometers. It would be the 6th largest tunnel in the world. And so even if this thing would be accepted by the Palestinians, that tunnel's not getting built. And Rome wasn't built in a day, and that tunnel's not getting built in a day, especially when you got to fight. They have the same crazy environmentalists in Israel, which are divided into a couple groups. They're call them, when you encounter them in some of the things in state government on legal basis when they're trying to shut everything down, we refer to them as the NIMBYs, not in my backyard, and the NOPEs, not on planet Earth. So that will be, so this isn't going to happen overnight. Here is a future state of Palestine. And again, you can see that it has sort of, it's the same map, but it's just a little bit more. They'll give them 2 economic zones down in the Negev, but it will not be up against the border of Egypt. There will be a security area there. Now, it's interesting, if you look at the map on the right, this is the partition map that the UN put out. And like I said, everybody's had a map. The UN partition had a map. 1949 armistice had a map. Oslo had a map. Maps, maps, maps. Just Google maps in Israel, and you will come up with, I'm going to guess, in the millions out there. And so here is the partition plan from 1947. And you can see that there is somewhat of a correlation a little bit between the Trump map for Palestine and this one, particularly the area down in the Negev. Now, they've never had that area, but they're going to get that area. So that's extra land that they get. But then Israel gets some extra land. And the Palestinian area is smaller than it was. Again, this is the state of Israel. And then here's the future Palestinian state. So that's a little bit better detail for it. And again, there were maps of all kinds. This is the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday, the day after the announcement. And on the left here is you have, I'm trying to remember which is, okay. The map right there on the left now, that is the Oslo map. So Oslo had a map. And you can see how it sort of divided things into Area A, B, and C. Area A under complete Palestinian control. Area B was joint security, and Area C was Israeli control. And you can see how it was highly split up. Israel kept a lot of Area C for that. Now, the Trump plan, you can see that that's what it was at Oslo. How it was going to look was to be the subject of negotiation. And so here is the Trump offer for the proposed state. So you can see that there's been some land swaps. So there's some things that are being done that are kind of interesting. For example, at Nablus up here in the north, that is the city where Shechem is. That's also the city where Jacob's well is. We've been there. We were there a couple years ago. It's also the city where a very famous Jew is buried. That's Joseph. His tomb is in Shechem. If you look at the end of Genesis, when Joseph said, listen, don't bury me here in Egypt. When you go to the promised land, take my bones with me and bury me there. So Israel was in Egypt, depending on who you view on the timeline, from around 230 to 430 years. And then when Israel left Egypt, they had the Exodus for 40. So they're dragging Joseph all over the desert down there around Sinai. And eventually they come into the land and they bury him, and you can read about it in the book of Joshua. They bury him at Shechem, and that's a very controversial area. When we were there, we couldn't go to the tomb of Joseph. Even though when you're at the Tell at Shechem, you can almost see where it is. But the security situation was such that you couldn't, and the Jews liked, Orthodox religious Jews, liked to go there and pray. Not to pray to Joseph, but to remember what Joseph meant to the people of Israel. And he was a very important person. He's a very important person to the church. He's a type of Christ, the suffering servant. But what the proposal is in the new peace plan is that there will be a corridor so that the Jews will have more access to the tomb of Joseph. Right now, they have 1 day a month that they can go there under heavy security IDF guard to pray at the tomb, and it's at 2 a.m. in the morning. And then this is the thing that I think a lot of people that are pro-Palestinian don't acknowledge, is the Jews have an enormous tie to the land, historically, archaeologically, religiously. And the biblical heartland is this area that's in orange. Hebron in the south, Shechem in the north, Samaria. This is where the Bible took place. Shiloh, or Shiloh if you prefer. And so, which would be a little bit north of Ramallah. So this is the biblical heartland. And it has been denied. The thing is, there are Arabs and Arab Muslims that live in Israel. They're citizens of Israel. They can vote for members of the Knesset. And But other than the settlements, you will never have a Jewish citizen of a Palestinian state. It will be Jew-free. They talk about that. And nobody, I don't understand, the pro-Palestinians never mentioned that fact. And they want to call Israel the apartheid state. It's typical of people on the left. They always accuse you of being what they really are. So let's just look at a couple of the things. Jerusalem will remain the sovereign capital of the state of Israel, and it should remain an undivided city. The sovereign capital of the state of Palestine should be in the section of East Jerusalem, located in all areas east and north of the existing security barrier, including Karf Akab, the eastern part of Shuafat, and Abu Dis, and could be named Al-Quds, or another name is determined by the state of Palestine. So here is a map on the left, is the security barrier. That's sort of an outline of the security barrier. And on the right is a 2007 map of the security barrier. Now, a couple things about that. The security barrier was put up in part because there were snipers firing across certain areas and shooting at people in Jerusalem and elsewhere. And so they put the barrier up. It's not always a big wall or anything like that. Some places it's just a security fence. But in the area down here around Bethlehem, it is a wall. It has guard towers and that type of thing. And there are checkpoints that you have to go through to get into from Bethlehem into Jerusalem, or vice versa. So the area of East Jerusalem that, now you will note on this map done in 2007, you see right here is the old city. The Temple Mount would be right over here in that corner. This is the Mount of Olives. This is Mount Scopus, where you have great views of the old city and the modern city of Jerusalem. And they have West Jerusalem. And so this whole area really is what they would call the Jerusalem Governorate. So what they're proposing is this Palestinian state. One of the places would be Abu Dis. The orange areas are largely inhabited by Palestinians. The dark areas are Israeli settlements. So you might remember this is Ma'al Adumim. This is a Jewish settlement on the outskirts, a few miles outside of Jerusalem. Very controversial. They want to annex that almost immediately. But Abu Dis here would sort of be the capital area of Palestine. Now, the other area that they were talking about is, there's a refugee camp here, and then the other place, the Akab, is all the way in the north up here by Ramallah, way up here. And so how they're going to reconfigure that, so, there's a big argument going on. Are they dividing Jerusalem? They're not dividing Jerusalem. Well, it depends how you define Jerusalem to begin with. And if you define it in a certain way, then you're not dividing it. But if you include what was really East Jerusalem on a lot of maps before now, I think you are kind of dividing it. I don't think there's any question about that. Now, the Palestinians have said, we don't want anything to do with a state. The people in Abu Dis will say, don't call us a East Jerusalem. We're Abu Dis. And I'll mention that in just a moment too. So how they're going to divide all this and how they're going to connect Ma'al Adumim to Jerusalem under Israeli control is kind of interesting. Now, one of the things that is true that is different is that the areas around the old city will be under Israeli control. The old city will be under Israeli control, and neighborhoods to the south of the old city, like the city of David, which is a big archaeological site, we've talked about that a lot, which is built over the city of David. The Arab village on top of it is called Silwan. And there's a theory that, the temple really was in the city of David. It'll be in Silwan. And I think part of what drove that is that, we know the temple will be rebuilt, and it's going to be difficult to rebuild it if it's on the Temple Mount. I mean, that would cause a war. But we can rebuild it in the city of Silwan. But believe me, if you're going to try to build that in the city of Silwan, it's not going to be any easier than it would be on the Temple Mount because it's an Arab neighborhood. mostly Muslim, and so it would be, whatever concerns you would have about building it on the Temple Mount would be just as great if you're building it in Solon. But it's interesting that this is a little bit different than other plans before in that it does propose more Israeli control over the old city and some of those areas. And so the capital, they say, would be Abu Dis, and then this place up here by Ramallah, outside the security barrier. So as you can see right now, you have a problem. What's the problem? Well, they're kind of disconnected. You know, you see the security barrier. So if you want to go from Abu Dis to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles in Kar Abkab, you would have to take kind of unless they build special roads, you would take a bit of a circuitous route to get there. And so your Google Maps would do that. In fact, when I was there the last time, Brian Schrager and I, we walked around the old city outside the walls one day. And it was interesting because I had my Google Maps on. And as we were walking, you know, we go to the Western Wall, then we go out through the Dung Gate and then down along the southern part of the southern steps and everything. But about 6 or 7 times, I get this buzz on my iPhone saying, "You're entering a foreign country. Do you want to enter a foreign country?" And I'm like, because the Google Maps people, I don't know which map they accepted, but it was a map that, well, you know, Israel doesn't really control this part. It's an Arab part. So this is all very difficult. And you can see the security barrier here. By the way, if you look here at the security barrier, there's this myth that's grown up by the people at Christ at the checkpoint, that Bethlehem is surrounded by a wall. And it's not surrounded by a wall. That is, what do we call that? It's a lie, that's right. Thank you. Just shout them out, folks. They're very simple questions. So here again is the sort of the focus on that city. This is sort of a Google Earth, has a new browser function to it. It's very interesting. It gives you a lot of 3D maps. So here's Ma'ale Adumim. Here is Abu Dis in this area. And then, you know, all the way up here is Ramallah. And then, so here's that Kafir Akab, or whatever that is called. So you see that getting that as a contiguous East Jerusalem is going to be a difficult task. So the other thing is that, in my view, it does divide the land. And this has become pretty controversial over the past week about, is it okay? Did Trump really divide the land or propose dividing the land? My view is, I don't think there's any question that he did. I mean, I just don't see how you can look at the maps and a proposed Palestinian state and a state of Israel that he's not divided the land. And this is what Joel chapter 3 says. For behold, in those days, and at that time when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted or divided my land. Now, the judgment there is on the nations for dividing the land of Israel. And as I look through the sort of the cumulative scriptures, I don't see that dividing the land of Israel is ever a good thing for the people that do it. For example, God used the Babylonians to bring judgment on the Jewish people in the Babylonian captivity that started about 606 BC, and the last one was about 586 BC. They took them to Babylon in 3 waves. And Babylon was the instrument that God used to judge Israel. But what was the other thing is, Babylon, you're going to get yours for what you did to my land. Even though they were, so the land is very important, and dividing the land is a problem. Now, listen, Israel doesn't occupy all the land that they're going to occupy during the millennium, but they're not going to occupy all that land until the millennium. And the judgment in the Valley of Jehoshaphat takes place before the millennium for people who have divided the land. Now, my conclusion from all of that is Don't divide the land. It's not a good thing. And listen, if Barack Obama or Bill Clinton had come out and said, with this exact same map, conservatives, evangelicals would be screaming bloody murder about dividing the land. And so we can't deny that the land is being divided. Now, is that going to result in judgment on the United States? It makes me nervous. I don't think it's a good thing. Now, somebody will say, well, it's not divided until the Palestinians accept it. But the point is, you want to divide the land. What do they say? Intent is 9/10 of the law sometimes. So that's the thing. So the problem of Gaza, here it says here, the United States does not expect the state of Israel to negotiate with any Palestinian government that includes any members of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or surrogates thereof, unless that Palestinian government, including its members from Hamas or PIJ, unambiguously and explicitly commit to nonviolence, recognize the state of Israel, and fully satisfy the other Gaza criteria set forth in Section 9. This is a very detailed plan, 181 pages. Here's a part about Jerusalem. It says, Jerusalem must remain a city that brings people of all faiths together. And there's some, there's some inconsistencies here, I think, about how they want to deal with the Temple Mount. I think they're kind of fudging a little bit to try to make it palatable to both sides, and I don't think they do a very good job. So it says here, Jerusalem must remain a city that brings peoples of all faiths together to visit, to worship, to respect each other, and to appreciate the majesty of history and the glory of God's creation. Not too bad about that. But listen, what they also do, they have a section about Judaism and Jerusalem being important. They have a section about Christianity, and Jerusalem is important to Christianity. And then they cite this passage from the Quran. For Islam, Jerusalem acquires prominence as stated in the Holy Quran. Glory to him who made his servant go by night from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque, whose surroundings we have blessed, that we might show him some of our signs. According to Islamic tradition, the verse refers to the Prophet Muhammad's nocturnal journey from Mecca to Jerusalem. He arrives at the area of the Temple Mount and ascends to heaven. Now listen, in the Quran, Jerusalem is never mentioned. In the Bible, 700-800 times Jerusalem is mentioned as being important to Christians and Jews. And this is the problem I have with King Abdullah. King Abdullah is always saying, we got to protect, the Jewish and Christian, or the Islamic and Muslim and Christian holy sites. And he never mentions the Jewish holy sites. Never, ever mentions them. And people praise him, oh, what a great peacemaker he is. I don't buy it. So, and by the way, you can find verses in the Quran that says, God called out the Jewish people and he gave them a land. It says that in the Quran. But you see now, any place that Islam has taken over, they have to have complete control. They can never let anybody else control it. So they're not even really following the dictates of that part of the Quran. And Jerusalem is never mentioned. So that's what they also say. But then this is where they're kind of inconsistent, because they say on the one hand, should be open to people of all faiths, right? But then they say, in particular, the status quo at the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, should continue uninterrupted. And what's the status quo? Because the Muslims are always building new mosques up there. This has been, they're up to like 5 or 6 now. That's not maintaining the status quo, I don't think. I guess we have quid pro quo, and then we have status quo, so we need to, whatever the quo is, we need to figure that out. So Jerusalem's holy site should remain open and available for peaceful worshipers and tourists of all faiths. People of every faith should be permitted to pray on the Temple Mount in a manner that is fully respectful to the religion, taking into account the times of each religion's prayers and holidays, as well as other religious factors. And the Muslims, they have said they're never going to agree to this. Jerusalem will remain the sovereign capital. There are some cities along the border on the Israeli side that are largely Arab. And so with those people, they're going to give them a choice. You can become part of the Jewish state, or you can stay part of, you can say citizens of Israel, or you can become a citizen of the Palestinian state, or you can have a status as a permanent resident in Israel. So that's kind of an interesting thing. The reaction to it, there have been demonstrations, some riots, that type of thing. The Waqf of Jerusalem, this is controlled by the Kingdom of Jordan, King Abdullah. After the Trump deal unveiled, Jordan warns of a new reality on the Temple Mount. Listen to some of what it says in this statement. And this is a translation, so it's a little awkward at times. Praise be to God, Lord of the worlds, and prayers and peace be upon our master Muhammad, the Arab Hashemite prophet, the faithful, and his family and companions. Now, why did they say Hashemite prophet? Well, it's the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Abdullah claims to be a descendant of Muhammad. And so this tribal thing is very important in the Middle East, and I'll try to talk about that in just a moment. The Ministry of the Waqf, Islamic Affairs and Holy Sites, warns of imposing a new reality on the Blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque and Islamic and Christian holy sites and their care in Holy Jerusalem. This warning comes in light of the practices of the occupation authority to disrupt the work of the Holy Endowment and the daily incursions into the Blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque. What does that mean? That means Jews actually have the audacity to walk up on the Temple Mount. That's all that means, which aims to impose a temporal and spatial division. The mere presence of Jews up there is just almost more than they can bear. And it stresses that the Blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque is an Islamic endowment that does not accept partnership and that non-Muslims do not have any right in it. And the ministry, under the direction of His Majesty King Abdullah II, continues to perform its duty to defend the Blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque and the holy sites. The ministry affirms that the three royal no's about resettlement and alternative homeland, and Jerusalem were and will remain among the national constants that emphasize the Jordanian role in supporting the Palestinian cause. And here was a meeting in Jerusalem, or in Ramallah, where Mahmoud Abbas came out. Now, Mahmoud Abbas, he comes out and says Jerusalem's not for sale. Before this, he said, Trump is a dog, the son of a dog, before the peace plan was announced. And that is a huge insult in a Muslim context, to call someone a dog or a son of a dog. So he's just, listen, we're not going to let this happen. Our people will send the deal to the garbage bins of history. We have just heard Trump and Netanyahu talking about the slap of the century. We will respond to this slap with multiple slaps, inshallah, in the future. Having heard these statements, which were nonsense from the beginning to end, we say 1,000 times no, no, no to the deal of the century. Dear brothers, I consider this deal to be the culmination of the Balfour Declaration. Then he goes into a long thing about, listen, Balfour Declaration came from Britain, but it was American. The Americans were behind all of this. It says here, the deal of the century is based on the Balfour Declaration, which was created by America and Britain. Some may find this strange. America, yes, America and Britain. It was America that formulated the Balfour Declaration in agreement with Britain. So he goes on, and there's this about a 28-minute speech. We shall continue our efforts and our struggle. This is near the end of his speech. In order to reach an independent Palestinian state, with East Jerusalem, its capitals, within the borders of June 4, 1967. That's before the Six-Day War. I think he has. We say to the world, we are not a terrorist people. We have never been a terrorist people. We are committed to the fight against terrorism. I'm thinking of that Pinocchio commercial. Somebody sent me a picture that Adam Schiff had auditioned for that part, but they said, no, you're overqualified. And so they talk about the UN resolutions. I said at the Security Council that I want an international conference of negotiations led by the quartet. And he goes on to sort of talk about the history of the negotiations that have taken place. But we're not going to negotiate on this, so they have this meeting. The Arab League has a meeting in Cairo on Friday or Saturday, and they say, Emergency meeting. The Arab League rejects the Trump plan. Now, the Arab News says, don't reject new Trump peace plan, Abbas urged. But when you really dig down into the details, it's a little bit more difficult to dig out than that, because they're not so much saying you have to accept the peace plan. You have to use this as a starting point for negotiations. And Abbas says, well, I'm not negotiating. And so the reaction of the Palestinians, it's very fitting that I'm talking about the Palestinian reaction to this particular effort to achieve peace on Groundhog Day, because it just seems like the same thing keeps repeating over and over again. And so this is someone, I won't identify the person that wrote this, but Abbas has refused to negotiate. But the truth is, he admits he'll present a counterproposal to the UN Security Council, which the US and Israel are sure to counter, which means Abbas is negotiating, whether he knows it or not, or whether he'll admit it. What Abbas has objected to from the beginning is that the US cannot be an impartial referee, so Abbas is seeking to use the UN Security Council for that purpose. And my friend concludes, things are getting interesting, and it is interesting. Abbas says he'll cut security ties with the US and Israel in this speech. Reactions from different quarters have been, as you would expect. In Iran, Tehran Times, highway to hell. This is talking about the plan. Satanic U.S. police plan will never bear fruit. Ayatollah Khamenei tweeted this: to the dismay of U.S. politicians, the satanic evil U.S. policy about Palestine, the so-called deal of the century, will never bear fruit by the grace of God. About that Jewishization of Al-Quds and say that it should be in the hands of Jews, they're talking foolishly and unwisely. The issue of Palestine will never be forgotten. Foreign Minister Zarif from Iran tweeted this. You see, he crossed out vision for peace, and it was sleepwalking into catastrophe. That was his take on the Trump map. President Erdogan of Turkey got in place. Now, he met yesterday with the head of Hamas in Istanbul and said he hoped to meet with some of the other Islamic terror group leaders. Daily Sabah, which is essentially his mouthpiece, says Jerusalem is sacred to Muslims. He gave a speech in Ankara the other day. If we can't protect the sanctity of the Al-Aqsa Mosque today, listen to this. Tomorrow we won't be able to prevent evil eyes from turning to Kaaba, especially with this mindset, we can't avoid it. This is a guy who wants to run the Middle East. But listen to how he characterizes the importance of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is our red line. I feel pity when we look at the reactions the countries of the Islamic world give about the text. And then he goes on to name the Arab countries that he has a beef with. Saudi Arabia, why aren't you raising your voice? When will you say something? Oman, Bahrain, and Abu Dhabi, they join them and applaud the presentation of plans. Shame on you, shame on you. You kind of get a bitter feeling for where Erdogan is coming from. As it has been for thousands of years, the key to world peace today is in Jerusalem. If the plane tree of peace collapses in Jerusalem, the whole world will be trapped under it. Leaving Jerusalem entirely, Israel's bloody clause, will be the greatest harm done to humanity. But do you see the confluence of what the Bible says and what's actually happening about the importance of Jerusalem? Anyone who sits back and watches the oppression of Palestinians and the harassment of Jerusalem encourages Israel, and so is responsible for the grave consequences. Leaving the security of the Palestinian people and state to the occupier Israel is no different than letting the fox guard the hen house. So that's sort of some of the Arab response. Yishel Fleischer, who is the international director of the Jewish community of Hebron, has a very good article, and he talks about the myth of Arab buy-in. It's a Daily Wire. You can look it up. I really don't have time to go into it. It's a great article that you should read. It will sort of set things in place. Another article I think you should read is Brian Schrager has an article that was in the Jerusalem Report, but now it's on the Jerusalem Post, jpost.com website, about the Mahdi belief among Iranian leadership. It's a very important article that you should go read. So Brian Schrager, Jerusalem Post, about the Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I, in Iran. It's not behind a paywall or anything. But here's what Yishel Fleischer says. When speaking with liberal-minded folks about the solutions to the Arab-Israeli conflict, including the recently revealed deal of the century, inevitably the question of Arab buy-in arises. When will Palestinians accept it? Is the oft-heard refrain. While this may seem a pretty responsible decision, hang on, I need to turn off my... my cursor's frozen. While this may seem to be a pretty responsible question, it actually reveals a fundamental lack of understanding of the Middle East. Here is a true story involving one of my mentors, Dr. Mordecai Kedar. It helpfully illustrates Middle East thinking. Kedar has crafted an alternative to the two-state solution that is called the Emirates Plan, 7 independent city-states. And here is, there we go. Here is a map of that. And what he says is, look, you need to, Dr. Kedar, and Yishel Fleischer, you've seen him in some of the videos I played about Hebron, is a student of Dr. Kedar's. And one of the things that I think people don't understand is the tribal nature of the Arab world. So when you go to Ramallah and Abbas comes there, he's not liked in Ramallah by and large, because he's from a tribe in the north, up around Jenin. And so, see that city up there, so they're very tribal, and they don't even get along with each other. So he says, what we need to do is we need to do like they've done in the United Arab Emirates, is set up these tribal areas that maybe be independently governed or will be joined together like the United Arab Emirates. It's a very fascinating solution to this problem. And so that's why when you see the reaction of the people in Abu Dis, that they're going to be, they live in East Jerusalem, they say, we're not part of East Jerusalem. That's because of the tribal, I suspect, I'm not entirely sure, that's because of the tribal nature of their culture. They really don't have strong relations with the people on the other side of the security barrier. So how do you make peace with people who can't even make peace among themselves? That's the problem. So this is interesting. Well, here's what he says. He says, Israel's a small Jewish enclave within the massive, predominantly Arab Middle East. It is therefore important to understand the regional mindset. While in the West, seeking consent and acquiescence is a sign of respect, equality, and moral uprightness, in the Middle East, that same attitude may be insensitive. Trying to elicit public Arab buy-in can inadvertently put Arabs on the uncomfortable position of having to openly repudiate their religion and their nationalism, even if they like the plan. Ironically, we have arrived at a time where much of the Arab world is looking for an excuse to wind down the 100-year war against Israel, which they realize is fruitless and continues to their own detriment. So go read the article. It is very interesting about how it comes out. Other reactions to the plan, I think this was a fairly, this is Daniel Pipes in the Washington Times on Thursday, reservations about the Trump peace plan. Now, these are some of the, I couldn't remember where I put this stuff about his leaks. These are the leaks that he analyzed that, as I said, if you look through the list, it's kind of interesting. But here's what Daniel Pipes says. I worry that like every previous and failed scheme to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Trump plan is based on giving the Palestinians hope. That sounds nice, but it is profoundly counterproductive. And Dr. Pipes, who care will tweeted this week and said he's one of the worst Islamophobes on the planet, to which Dr. Pipes responded, "Thank you, I consider that a compliment coming from you." And his point is, to really have peace, you have to soundly defeat the enemy. And that's never happened in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's always, it's sort of tamping it down, but not a clear defeat. So his view is that there's really not going to be peace until that happens. Caroline Glick also has a great article in Israel Hayom called "The Oslo Blood Libel is Over." I think you need to go look it up. She was on the Oslo negotiating teams post-Oslo back in the mid-90s. And she says, when Israel embarked on the Oslo peace process, it accepted Oslo's foundational assumption that Israel is to blame for the Palestinian war against it. From the first Oslo agreement signed on the White House lawn on September 13, 1993, through all of its derivative deals, Israel was required to carry out confidence-building measures to prove its good faith and peaceful intentions to Arafat and deputies. So while she has written a book called The One-State Solution, she is very appreciative of what President Trump here. She recounts a story talking to, on Sunday morning, I met with Ambassador David Friedman on the details of the plan just before he flew to Washington. I asked what the boundaries of the settlements would be. She lives in one of the settlements. He said that they have a map. It isn't precise, so it can be flexibly interpreted, but it has developed in consultation with Israeli government experts. Suspicious, I went granular. Khan al-Amar is an illegal and strategically located Bedouin encampment on the access road to Kafar Adumin, a community north of Jerusalem. Israel's Supreme Court ordered it to be removed. I asked if this camp is on the American map. Ambassador Friedman answered in the affirmative. What about the area called E1, which connects it to the city of Malah Adumin in Jerusalem? Yes, it's inside the map, he said, inside the Israeli-controlled area. How about the illegal building part right outside the northern entrance to my community, Efrat, south of Jerusalem, in Gush Etzion? The massive illegal building there threatens to turn Efrat's highway access into a gauntlet. Is that area going to be under Israeli jurisdiction? He nodded. How about the isolated communities? Yes, 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 he said. Our map foresees Israel applying its sovereignty to about half of Area C. So she's very grateful for that. And so in that respect, there's things to like about the Trump plan. Okay? So, and it does sort of change things on the ground. It's really a game changer. So the question becomes, well, is this part of Bible prophecy? And the answer is, I don't think it's the covenant that starts the 70th week. My contention has long been, we always talk about confirmation of the covenant with regard to Daniel 9:27, where it talks about that. He'll confirm the covenant with the many for 1 week. But what's the covenant exactly? And so I see people running around saying, this is the covenant. Other people saying, this is not the covenant. And my question is, what is the covenant going to be? I think the prophecy community really needs to have a good discussion about what this might be. Because there's a lot of theories about what it is. And so everybody can say, well, this is not it. I know it's not it. And I see other people saying, this is it, or it's going to be it when the Antichrist comes along. So the answer is, I think it is a step down the road towards that. Now, after the meeting, Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin. And one of the things that came out of that meeting was a young lady who had been held in Russian prison for a while is now back in Jerusalem or Israel and free. And so that was good. And, Putin is trying to recast himself and put himself in a different light. And this is very significant. In fact, the the reports this week were, and this I think was confirmed by Russians, that he's rechanging the Constitution, and one of the titles that they're suggesting for his new role would be Supreme Leader. I'm not kidding. I said maybe it should be Greatest of the Great, GOG. That was just my suggestion a little bit, my contribution to the controversy. So it's just such an interesting thing. Now, I've talked about this the last couple of weeks, and I finally was able to get a copy of it, the Strategic Survey for Israel, put out by the Israeli National, trying to remember whether it's the National Institute for National Security Studies, INSS. And it's on the brink of escalation. Multiple challenges demand a new strategy. And they're talking about what is Israel facing this year? Now, I'm of the view that I don't think like an Ezekiel 38 and 39 war is imminent. I don't think it's going to be happening in the next few months. There are a lot of pieces that have to come together. Nevertheless, I see a lot of the background preparations, alliances, and that sort of thing coming together, sort of. And it's kind of an up and down thing. Some weeks it's stronger, other weeks it's weaker. So I think it's coming. I just don't think it's coming next week, just for some mainly logistic purposes. But I have no doubt that it's coming. So when I talk about it, it's not that I'm being inconsistent. I think it's coming, but I don't think it's coming right now. And so by the way, when people back in the 60s talked about Ezekiel 38 and 39 coming, nobody said, well, you're being inconsistent. You're not even listening to yourself. And it's just not true. But when I look at I survey the landscape of all these different reports and things coming out, I see this. And so here's the map that they have, the struggle for the shape of the Middle East as of late 2019. The orange areas are areas of unrest. Red areas are ones where there's actual war and fighting going on. It looks like the Middle East is in a bit of a mess. And mind you, this is secular people that are talking about this. Now, one of the things I've talked about is sort of the Iranians and how they think. You'll have to listen to the translation, and this kind of jumps in the middle of it. The head of the IDF was at this, and you'll listen to somebody translating from Hebrew. There are subtitles that can read. I tried to get them enlarged, but I just didn't have time to do that. And he's talking about sort of the Iranian mindset. Listen to what he says here. No sound? Okay. Well, he says the Syrians know a thing or two about that, and the Iranians know a thing or two about strategy and tactics. They invented chess, didn't they? So things are becoming more complex. And then the IDF chief says, yeah, the answer is, yeah. First of all, the Persians did invent chess, and they know quite a few people that know exactly how to say mats or mate or checkmate in Persian. So it's just kind of interesting that we talk about the Persians invented chess and that type of thing. And here's a IDF head who says, yeah, they invented chess, and that they know how to play a complex game, and it's just a strategic game. So that's just kind of interesting. Another thing that is talked about is the northern arena towards a large-scale conflict. And a couple of the points here is evident risk of escalation stemming from Israel's ongoing campaign between wars. Assad regime recovers and regains territory, but remains dependent on Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. That's at least part of the conclusion of the people. And it's kind of interesting. There you see Putin, you see Russia, Iran, and Turkey. There's that process. So there were a number of people. There was a panel on Syria. I'm going to close with this. This is going to take about 12 minutes. This gentleman was talking about, there were 4 people on the panel. There was a Jewish lady, I can't remember where she was from, an Israeli lady. And she said, Assad's regaining power. He's going to come back to power. This guy says, not so fast, that the age of coups, that's C-O-U-P-S, may not be over in Syria. Syria's always had these coups. That's how Assad's father came to power. And he mentions Assad's brother, who is very powerful in some of the military of Syria. And could he take down his brother? So that was the other thing. Now, the last two people I'm going to play are really very, I think, important thinkers on the topic of Syria. One is Jonathan Spire, and the other is Jennifer Carafella. Jennifer Carafella is from the Institute for the Study of War. So first, Jonathan Spire, who talks about sort of the Iranian move into the Syrian theater, which we know from a Bible prophecy standpoint is pretty important. Listen to what he has to say. Okay, hang on a second here. Oh, that's it. My thing popped out. Okay.
Also the extent and
Okay,
broad involvement. Well, I think if we're looking at the issue of the Iranian involvement in Syria and the likely or possible direction of it now as the war is transforming or winding down, we need to first of all remind ourselves of the extent and broad dimensions of this involvement. And I think for reasons I'll go into in a moment, being aware of that extent and depth is of particular interest to the Israeli policy discussion in this regard. So if we, without going into enormous detail, I would suggest we think about 5 dimensions of the Iranian penetration into Syria. And these are the following. I would list them as the following. Firstly, the direct Iranian presence and construction of infrastructure by the Iranians inside Syria. Secondly, the presence of IRGC proxies, a.k.a. Hezbollah and the others, the Fatimiyun and so on and so forth, on Syrian soil. Thirdly, and interestingly, and I think sometimes overlooked, the presence of Iran-built structures within the official Syrian armed forces. Fourthly, what we would call Syrian Hezbollahs, that's to say locally recruited militia structures created by the Iranians inside Syria. And lastly, the broader Iranian effort to transform Syria from an ideological and to some degree also a demographic point of view. Now, if we take all those 5 together, I think what we are talking about is, as I would see it at least, a kind of application of the methodology and praxis of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps in Iran regarding the transformation of societies to the specific Syrian context, namely a context in which, one, there is an active war going on, and secondly, there is an absence of even nominal representative political structures of the kind that exist, for example, in Lebanon and also in Iraq. Now, this is a long way of saying a fairly simple thing, which is that the Iranian penetration into Syria is deep, is ambitious, and is multifaceted. The Iranians clearly don't want to leave. The Iranians on the ground have more or less autonomous control of considerable parts, particularly of southeastern Syria. If we think of Abu Kamal and then the road to Mayadin and then the roads westwards, these areas essential to the Iranians, they basically control. The regime and other forces don't really enter there. It's an Iranian area of control. So the Iranians clearly want to stay, and the Iranians look like they have the ability to stay. It will be difficult to push them out. Now, if we think about scenarios in which the Iranians might leave, we should, of course, first of all, identify those actors who might want the Iranians to leave and ask ourselves how they might try to achieve that. And here we can think of 3, the Russians, the Assad regime, and of course, Israel. With regard to Russia, it seems to me, for the considerable near future at least, there isn't, while there is certainly competition between Russia and Iran, and I agree with the previous speaker, my colleague here, that there is a contradiction in the projects of the two countries inside Syria. Nevertheless, it seems to me, for the immediate future at least, there is also a commonality of interest in staying for at least the period in which the regime is is reconstructing itself, at least for the period in which the regime does not yet have complete control over the territory. I don't think there will be an interest in Russia to push the Iranians out completely. Secondly, I don't think the Russians, precisely because of the lightness of their touch that you mentioned, have even the ability to do so. This kind of applies to Assad himself also, I would say. Assad, without going into enormous detail, is immensely weak still. Assad has won the war because of Iran and because of Russia. But if you look at his independent, also military abilities, deeply, deeply limited. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, for this discussion at least, Israel. The point regarding Israel, Israel has the clear policy goal of the complete departure of Iran from Syria. This is a stated goal of Israeli policy. Think about the 5 dimensions I talked about. Perhaps we can get into this further in discussion. The point is that these 5 dimensions cannot be destroyed by the use of air power alone. It doesn't matter how good the air power and the intelligence is, and in the Israeli case, it's very good. It is simply, these factors are simply not amenable to be destroyed in their entirety by the application of air power. And therefore, there is, in my estimation at least, a contradiction somewhere close to the heart of Israeli policy in this regard. Quickly, with regard to Russia, and I'll deal with it in less detail because I'm short of time, just to say, in a sense, a similar point. The Russian interest in Syria, both from a strategic and from a diplomatic point of view, in terms of the gains Russia has made over the last decade of involvement now, are considerable indeed. We're talking about the emergence of the Eastern Mediterranean as a strategic contest area of our interest, the presence of the Russians in Tartus, the considerable development of the Tartus naval base and of Latakia as well, will be crucial as a foothold on the Eastern Mediterranean. To the Russians, the Khmeimim air base, of course, with regard to strategic issues, and diplomatically, and I won't have time to go into it in detail, but diplomatically, Russia has made itself the key arbiter of every single, more or less every single conflict system on Syrian soil, whether it's Israel against the Iranians, whether it's the Turks against the Kurds, whether it's the Turks against Assad, whether it's Assad against the Kurds. Every road mentioned runs through Moscow. The Russians are a key arbiter in all of those. That's very clear diplomatic power and influence, and the Russians will be loath to give it up. So bottom line and final sentence, just to say, I agree, I think, with both earlier speakers to say the emergent post-war Syrian Assad regime is a weak regime indeed. One cannot overstate its weakness. It's going to be weak for a long time to come, which means that the influence of its allies who saved it, both Iran and Russia, is going to go on to be very, very considerable indeed in the period now opening up. Thanks.
That's Jonathan Spire. Excellent. I highly recommend his work. He writes a lot in the Jerusalem Post and sometimes in the Wall Street Journal. I highly recommend virtually everything that he writes. He is very familiar with the area, particularly Syria and the Kurdish regions. Now, Jennifer Carafella from the Institute for the Study of War, and she's going to take a little bit different tack, but I think she's an important voice in this. I use them as a resource a lot. So here are her views on the Syrian situation.
I'd like to start by framing a bit of how I see Syria's trajectory for the next 10 years, because it will inform the comments I'm going to make about the U.S. role I would like to see us to play, as well as the role I think we're more likely to play, given where this current administration is headed. There are 3 key factors. So I actually don't share the assessment that Syria is headed into some kind of post-war phase. I don't think that Bashar has won the war. And unfortunately, I think that 10 years from now, it's always difficult to predict, but I think 10 years from now, Syria is actually likely to remain a war zone, given many of the underlying conditions that are still present. And there are 3 key factors or drivers that I think are important to keep in mind as we consider the trajectory of this theater. The first is the deep and enduring fragility of the Assad regime. Assad, as was mentioned, I think, by General Votel in his statements, cannot secure terrain that he recaptured as recently as 2018. As General Votel mentioned, the attack campaign against the regime and its backers in Dara province alone has returned to 2011 levels. We share that assessment, and we've been watching very closely how that insurgency is gaining traction. Slowly, it's not making too many headlines, but it is gaining traction and freedom of movement. What does that tell you? It means that Assad's gains are much more impressive on a map than they are in reality. Comments have already been made that I definitely agree with in terms of the structure of the regime's military forces and the challenges that Assad has in consolidating. But the reason I point to the regime's fragility as a driver of future conflict is in part because it's going to get a lot worse for the regime in the next coming years. Assad's economy has already completely collapsed. It's in a complete freefall, due in part to the collapse of the economy in Lebanon. And Assad's financial outlook is even worse in 2020. The US just passed a major piece of legislation titled the Caesar Bill, which creates authority to add significantly sanctions not only on the Assad regime and its cronies that are preying upon the Syrian population and getting rich in the process, but also adds additional sanctions, authorities for additional sanctions on Russia and Iran. Anybody essentially that provides any kind of financial, technical, or military support to the Assad regime could face significant and severe sanctions in 2020. So Assad's not going to have the resources that he needs to pay his warlords and to try to buy off local populations at exactly a time when the military cost of holding on terrain that he's already recaptured is increasing due to that insurgency that I just mentioned. Furthermore, the Russians are actually very limited in their ability to solve this problem for Assad, and not just financially. The Russians are not going to get the reconstruction aid that they've been wanting for the regime for quite a few years, given the Caesar Bill. But the Russians actually are much more limited in their ability to project military power in Syria than is often discussed. The effect of the Russian air campaign has, of course, been completely devastating for the Syrian population and for the aid workers and other civilian actors that should not be targeted by the Russian air campaign, but which are targeted with precision, violating all sorts of international laws. But the Russian ground presence is much thinner. And I mention that because air power is not going to save Assad from an insurgency. Air power was helpful in retaking major terrain because it was devastating, as I mentioned, and because it started to change the calculus of rebels on the ground, who then began to agree to surrender deals. Those surrender deals that the Russians helped broker are exactly what is now unraveling. The Russian military police has been attempting to repair them and to keep some kind of minimum level of stability in Daraa, as well as in Aleppo and other places, and that's breaking down. The other example I'll point to of Russian limits is that it actually took them quite a while to project power into northeastern Syria, and they had to deploy additional military police into Syria to do that. They are now beefing up that presence, and it is more significant. However, the Russians are not going to be able to solve either that financial or the military problem that Assad faces in the months to come. The second key driver that I'll point to is the terrorist organizations. Specifically, the Salafi jihadi organizations, ISIS and al-Qaeda. ISIS is down but not out, and is regrouping fastest in areas that the Assad regime controls, and is going to exacerbate that prior problem, the fragility of the regime. ISIS is regaining not territorial control yet, but the ability to challenge territorial control for the Assad regime, and they are concentrating their attacks on lucrative oil and natural gas fields and infrastructure in central Syria in order, with the deliberate intent, to accelerate further unraveling of regime control. Furthermore, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other al-Qaeda-linked groups in the northwest remain strong. They are losing terrain in the fight in Idlib right now, and that creates the perception, again, that Assad is going to reconquer the country, but I don't think that that's true. The jihadist infighting, I do think, has undermined their military effectiveness, but they are very well positioned to benefit from the conditions of additional vacuum that will likely follow as the Syrian regime continues to collapse economically. Finally, there are competing campaigns of indoctrination underway in Syria, with multiple actors trying to change the fabric of the local Syrian society. That includes the Turks, that includes the jihadists, with competing campaigns by al-Qaeda and ISIS. It also includes America's local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces, huge elements of which are indoctrinating both Kurdish and Arab civilians and fighters into a very particular ideology, which of course has triggered the Turkish intervention. That may not cause further war in the immediate term. However, it does set, especially in conditions of continued violence, as I expect to see in Syria, conditions for long-term conflict that unfortunately I do not think we yet have an answer for. So what does that mean? It means that Syria is anybody's game. I don't think that the current US military presence is sufficient to accomplish our national interests, and I'm happy to expand on that because I need to close. However, I do think it's important to keep in mind that we are not facing a strong reconquering and consolidating Assad regime with Russian and Iranian presence. We're facing a continued condition of state collapse. It is important that the US learns to navigate that space, and that we compete in the ways that we actually are most advantaged in competing, and tailored uses of military forces, American military forces, can make an outsized impact.
Okay, well, that's a lot of information, but I think that will help you a little bit better understand that despite what people say, Syria is still a huge mess. And into that vacuum are all sorts of players that are coming. Iran, jihadists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Russia, Turkey, and it's a mess. So I think there needs to be some kind of resolution on this before there's an assault on Israel, which I think eventually will come. So I want you to understand that the Syria is a vacuum, and the regime could completely collapse. It could slowly collapse. Jennifer Carafella is a brilliant analyst. Highly recommend her work, and Fred Kagan and others at the Institute for the Study of War. So what do we take away from all of this is, listen, these areas of conflict, deal of the century, potential peace, fighting, conflict, this is what the world is prophesied to be before this final period of time unfolds. How soon that is, I don't know, but certainly the infrastructure is in place. We could have the same talk about Libya, where there are contradictory people at odds with each other, Russia on one side and Turkey on the other. So it's just a very interesting time to be alive. Listen, the Bible tells us that this is the way the world will be before the Lord returns. Highly recommend, go through the INSS YouTube channel, and there's a ton of videos there on a lot of security topics from a conference that took place this week. So let's close in a word of prayer, and we'll leave. Fathers, thank you so much for your word. We pray that you will comfort us in this time, knowing that this is the way you predicted the world would be before the Lord's return. And pray that we will take that knowledge and use it as an impetus, an incentive to share the gospel with those around us, and to be strong in the faith and in the truth of the Word of God. We pray that you'll bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.